And we know, I know as a trans person and as an advocate for trans people, I'm sure many of you know as clinicians and providers for trans people, that if we take away these healthcare options, kids are going to die. And we see it, and I know it personally in my own life, watching people who have not had access to the care they need, and that has just resulted in so many catastrophic outcomes. The end game here is not banning care for trans minors. That is an entry point. The end game is banning care for all trans people. Those people, whether it's J.K. Rowling or Abigail Schreier or Stephen Levine, they have various forms of a platform that are being fed through a global, well-funded machine that has a very well-coordinated strategy to attack us and to create legal norms that make it impossible for us to survive.
You know, as a physician, you're taught you always have to have an answer, right? You're supposed to fake it until you make it. I think it's a problem with medical education. It's a problem with the practice of medicine, but that is where it is. And so people's brains go to this, like, I have to put a slide in about risks. And then I saw somebody else do a slide that says that testosterone causes liver damage. So I'm going to, all right, I've got that. But that actually, that whole like testosterone causes liver damage thing was used by Texas in their argument that this care is child abuse. And they actually cited a like well-known set of guidelines that are out there that had this information in it. So be intentional about, do I really need to put this information in? Is it grounded in reality? I think sometimes it's kind of like almost like a pimping question thing, like it's an interest. Well, there's some pros, but then there's some cons. There are some risks, but then there are some benefits. But those don't always have to be like, you don't have to have the same number of items in the risk column as the benefit column.
Many people are unaware of how much legal work WPATH members do, either pro bono or sometimes professionally, in concert with our association and in support of the standards of care. This work isn't publicized because WPATH doesn't function as an advocacy organization any more than other medical professional associations do. Just like the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Workers, the American Psychiatric Association, the Endocrine Society, and many other medical specialty professional groups, WPATH attempts to educate legislators, litigators, and the judiciary globally. We often provide clinical information or other intellectual support to educational friend of the court briefs or advisory communications to policymakers, and we may provide position papers to assist advocacy groups in their work to improve transgender health. WPATH's focus is on building the evidence base for clinical care and educating clinicians to increase the availability of knowledgeable and responsible care. Advocacy is surely part of our mission, but not our primary focus. And as those who seek to diminish the authority of the standards of care implore judges to ignore our evidence, expertise, and considered opinions, because they say we are nothing more than an advocacy organization. So we will advocate for the health of transgender and gender diverse people because we have seen the benefit that gender affirming care can provide.
So in conclusion, youth in the Trans Youth Can study did not undergo a battery of psychological testing to verify their gender identity. Overall, there was minimal regret for parents and no regret for youth. Parents' worries decreased over time and their support for their youth increased. This suggests that parents' feelings should not be prioritized over the youth's experience. There's no evidence to delay care based on the initial feelings of parents, given how their worries decreased over time and support increases.
I had to make a call to Child Protective Services on a case, and the Child Protective Services worker asked me about if some of the issues that I was calling about were about the parents not being supportive or being emotionally abusive around gender identity issues. And that was educative for me to learn that in my conservative state, there are at least some child protective service workers who are willing to enforce the need for affirmation by parents, at least with social transition needs, names, pronouns, etc. So that may be a resource in states, provinces, regions, countries around the world.
The standard of care is a very flexible document because we recognize that different locations in different areas, different cultures, different countries have different policies and different levels of access to the different providers and disciplines. So what we're putting forward is more of a gold standard, not necessarily you must do this. But we felt it was important to put forward a gold standard so that we all are striving to achieve what we can in the places that we do lack access.
If we look historically, there's been great work by people like Steph Schuster. Historically, these letter requirements were rooted in prejudice, but also in fear of stigma. They were afraid of being stigmatized as doctors and wanted to essentially cover their ass.
Flexibility in the assessment approach includes the number of sessions, recognizing that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach and we're guarding against any lengthy or unnecessary protocols. So we recommend flexibility with the completion of the assessment. So if, for example, you have a situation where the youth and family are ready, you've been working with them, everyone's on board, and completing the assessment would be a barrier to pausing irreversible changes, then the provider may go ahead and link the family with medical care so that that process is happening in tandem with the completion of the assessment, rather than it just being fully completed before even considering linking the family with medical providers to begin that part of the process.
And we'd like to kind of reframe this discussion of regret as something that we can help minimize with a client-centered focus and identification of embodiment goals.
Processing and understanding a youth's unique gender story, discussing the youth's embodiment goals.
One of the important components of adolescent assessment, and really assessment for anyone who is accessing medical care for gender care, is what are the person's embodiment goals? It's important to know that historically, a discussion of embodiment goals has been missing in adolescent and adult assessment. Once you're done asking the youth these questions, it's also important to get an idea from the caregivers about their ideas about the youth's embodiment goals, because sometimes they haven't talked about this or might be surprised to learn what the young person is saying. Also, embodiment goals may change over time. We can stop or adjust hormone therapy dose at any time.
And always a respect for autonomy, respect for the autonomy of the child to be able to know who they are, and bodily autonomy for what their embodiment goals are. They've had good outcomes with blockers and social transition, and doing so has helped solidify her embodiment goals. And given their level of distress and embodiment goals, this is clearly medically necessary. There's no confusion from them at any point. They're very clear and consistent about their embodiment goals.
So one of the things that I've noticed in my clinical practice is that it's been fairly frequent that a post-pubescent youth will come to me already on puberty suppression, and that they came to that, through the child path. And when I ask the youth or their parents about what they know about puberty suppression, how it works, how it functions, what it does for them, what it doesn't, all of the risks and benefits, it becomes pretty clear that those important discussions either didn't happen or they didn't happen in a way that they really stuck. And so that really concerns me, because I think it's really important to have informed consent around medical interventions.
But so what we do know is that adolescents actually have the capacity to make a reasoned, logical decision. And here's the other thing about chest surgery. If you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go and get them.
Okay, so if you don't do this, I'm not recommending you do this, but if you were to Google my name, don't do that. The first thing The first thing that you would see is that I send healthy 13-year-old girls to have their breasts removed, right? Because it came from a talk that somebody surreptitiously recorded me talking. It was obviously way out of context, and it got blown up and made into a YouTube video that was utilized in a court case in Texas. I think that a lot of this conversation outside of maybe these spaces gets talked about through a lens of like, how can we make sure people are really trans, right? And they're not going to regret their decision later. And I just want to be really clear about that, because that's actually not the discussion that I'm interested in participating in. I'm interested in discussing and having a conversation about giving the very best possible care to trans young people, the care that they need and deserve. On the top, we have the total sample, and you can see that life satisfaction, illness burden, and anxiety all significantly improved at the 12-month follow-up visit. But if we break this down by designated sex at birth, we see that the significance is primarily driven by the folks that are designated female at birth. And part of this finding has to do with the fact that testosterone probably induces more changes in the first year than estrogen does. And I think that we will find that these differences are going to hold across both of these subcohorts as time goes on and we look at longitudinal data at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, et cetera. We want to prioritize publishing this information because it needs to get out into the general public while there is this ongoing attack on transgender youth and transgender youth care, particularly targeted at people who are designated female at birth. The political climate has been very difficult to navigate. Just for reference, we've had Freedom of Information Acts 8 times on our grant. It's very difficult to respond to a Freedom of Information Act because they can get every single email between your all the sites and the NIH, all of the everything involved with the grant they can get, which is fine. There's nothing that we're hiding. It's just really difficult from a organizational standpoint. I asked our person at the NIH if there was a prize for the grant that got the most FOIA requests, and she said no, but even if there was, you would still be behind COVID and fluoride. So yeah, we get the bronze medal for FOIA requests. I think it's really hard to do clinical care and research under duress. It's very, very different than when I started doing this work. Every single manuscript is absolutely impeccable with what it is stating. The results that are being reported, we're thinking about how things can be taken out of context and misused and potentially come back and damage us. It's very, very tedious.
So in summary, our study found that older age and being designated male at birth predicts sexual activity prior to starting hormones, and sexual satisfaction did not improve after 2 years, but rather remained neutral.
Another question that came up relatively early relates to discussion about change from age-based criteria to pure congruent criteria. And I thought I just kind of throw in there, because I'm actually more on these guideline committees, the short answer being that there is recognition of that tension, but there are no plans with any of the guideline groups to do more than to recognize that tension. So to say out loud that the age-based criteria are just very, very rough guidance, and obviously pure congruent would make could make good sense.
So cognitive development does change over time. It allows for a reanalysis of the risk-benefit for each treatment when the timing is appropriate. Needs change over time. And in saying we believe sufficient maturity should be in place for a young person to make that decision, it's protective of the adolescent's identity development over time. So what about age? I mean, I really could not put that in here. I mean, it really is all relative. And let me talk about it for a moment. Age is one factor of identity development for an adolescent. It is, we all know that it's no two 14-year-olds are alike, no two 18-year-olds are alike, and no two 30-year-olds are alike. We appreciate the impact of including or not including age minimums. So there's risks associated with both scenarios, okay? And currently, the final document landed on protecting the criteria as I shared them with you, because ages were serving as a distractor from those important criteria, and that would not have allowed for adolescents to access the care that they need. And so in the end, the risk benefit is such that that would have happened had we included the ages. It also adds like an arbitrary element to the guidelines. The problem is it could be useful in providing a general framework of direction, and there's other potential downfalls to not including ages, such as that puts it in the hands of other entities that can then create their own policies and say, oh, sorry, not until age 18 can someone do this, for example, an insurance company. So the thought about ages is something that I can assure you was thought through a lot, and there was a lot of discussion about it, and everybody recognizes that there's no right or wrong to that per se. Our chapter's reflective of a consensus process, both through the Delphi, which meant that we needed to have every single statement run by the entire work group for the entire standard of care, and needed to achieve 75% consensus in order to be included. And so every single statement that you had was voted and went through that process.
And then as for our age cutoff for vaginoplasty, the age of surgical consent in Oregon is 15. However, we work individually with patients, their families, to really sort out when the best timing would be for them. And I'm finding that in a lot of our adolescent patients, the goal is to be able to recover at home prior to moving on to life after high school. And so for a lot of people, that will fall around the 17, 18-year-old age range, the summer after graduating high school.
The statement 10, helping understand the reproductive effects and understanding the loss of fertility and options to preserve fertility. Well, to what degree is a conversation important to have? How many people have heard the adolescent say, I don't want to talk about that, I'll just adopt, I know. We've all heard them, like that's said over and over. What I would say is it's important for us not to put our ideas about what should or shouldn't be when it comes to reproductive health, conversations into play. But an adolescent who says, I'm just going to adopt, leave me alone, is different than an adolescent who says, I don't really care about this right now, but I realize I'm a teenager. Maybe when I'm older, I could change my mind, but I don't think I will. That shows, that second group shows that that adolescent is capable of understanding that they don't know what their life may be like.
So we acknowledge the gender binary as a project of colonialism, as a product of colonialism, with a focus on pathologization and diagnosis. And we're reflecting on the history of gender care. We have seen, though, incredible strides to decrease restrictions on access to gender care for adults. However, unfortunately, we're seeing these same restrictions that were lifted for adults now being placed on youth. That can also be seen within the context of adultism. Bias. We encourage everyone to continue to assess and address bias within themselves as clinicians, as we have done as part of this collective.
Outcomes. There are various problems with an age-related threshold, whatever that is. One is discrimination. The WHO and United Nations have formally declared that any form of ageism is unethical. Discrimination based on age is a violation of one of the most fundamental human rights, the right to equality meant as non-discrimination. According to the European Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, age is an arbitrary feature that doesn't justify difference in treatment. Ageism generally refers to the treatment of older patients. However, younger people can be discriminated against by reason of age as well. Refusing to treat someone because they are too young is as unjust as refusing to treat someone because they are too old. Decisions shouldn't be based on age, but on capacity to benefit from treatment. Capacity to benefit from treatment and capacity to provide valid consent are often a function of age, but this is always the case.
So, question for all of you. Can every adolescent appreciate lifelong implications of their decisions? I'm sensing the parents probably are laughing. I would say some can and some can't. Does that matter? I guess so when we're talking about long-standing decisions. How do adolescents differ from adults in their approach to decisions? I talked about how they differ from children, but they certainly differ from the adults. The main questions to ask about each of these three are: how emotionally mature is the young person for their age in terms of their decision-making capacity? To what degree does the sought treatments address their core gender identity? And by core gender identity, I mean a gender that is internally true for that person. And then third, what's the relationship between the gender issues and the mental health related clinical presentations? And then three, to emphasize the importance of the ethical principles of autonomy and justice, and that respecting human rights is just as important as the evidence base. So our approach to evidence is, it's important because we work within evidence-based medicine and evidence-based practice, but it's not the only thing that can dictate what decisions get made, especially when a field is in evolution or is in its beginnings relatively. So the ethics of the treatment or not providing it, as well as the human rights that respect the notion that transgender youth have and should have the ability to go through their lives in as emotionally healthy a way as everyone else are just as important.
And so I really just want to talk about our charge moving forward. You know, the work that we do is important, it's life-saving, and you're all important, and you all deserve to be able to do your evidence-based, life-saving work free of harassment, political interference, or outright bans on care. We also have some responsibilities moving forward, and because this charge does bring great responsibility, we have to be evidence-based. We have to be measured in our approach, measured in dealing with the press, measured in dealing with conflict. Think before you speak. What can be taken out of context, what you say or do? We're all in this together. If we are fighting amongst ourselves, the forces of oppression have won. They want us to fight amongst ourselves. We are all on the same team. So let's keep pushing and fighting.
Once you feel like the media outlet itself is legitimate, you want to look at the reporter themselves. As Laura mentioned, a lot of times reporters these days that are covering gender-affirming healthcare and transgender issues are not dedicated to that beat, and so they might not have a lot of experience in this issue area. By and large, this gives you an opportunity to educate them, but it is worth checking if they have previously covered these topics, if they've done it in a compassionate and thoughtful way, or if there might be any red flags. If you see that they've covered other nuanced healthcare or social issues in a way that kind of sends up red flags for you, that's always a sign you can disengage.
When we're experts in a certain area, oftentimes we can fall into using acronyms, making assumptions about what people know because we're so used to being in a certain world, and these things are, second nature to us. And so I think it's really important for this to also think about, okay, who's my audience for this? Is it folks who really have a really clear understanding of this, will know what I'm talking about if I'm throwing out medical terms, or citing different types of research? Will people understand what that is? Or do I need to kind of take a little bit of a different approach and use language that's a little bit more accessible for a broader audience?
What we want to do here is reassure that there is a body of evidence that is strong and supports that gender-affirming healthcare is safe and effective. Organizations like USPATH, WPATH have vetted this research and agreed that the standards of care are safe and effective, and that we continue to update that field of evidence, right? There's always new research coming out. And that's going to just sort of continue to add to the data that we have.
When reporters are talking about gender affirming care, when politicians are, they sort of talk about it as if it's this like anomaly that's like completely different from all other healthcare. And so I think bringing it back as much as you can to just, this is how all healthcare works. We're constantly doing research and trying to improve it and like updating standards, and that's always what we do.
So we want to really push back on that and really make clear that gender affirming care is tailored, it's individualized to be age appropriate and to reflect the unique needs and maturity of patients. And so that's where the expertise of providers is really important, and sort of blanket restrictions or limitations on care based on age are really arbitrary, and we need to leave it to the experts to make informed decisions about how to best treat their individual patients.
They are being pushed by a very small cabal of people who are interested in using trans people for political power. They're also part of a broader campaign to command and control other people's bodies. This is part and parcel of the fall of Roe v. Wade and the decimation of abortion rights nationwide. It is also a continuation of the project of white supremacy. There's also a new agenda for, I love an agenda, I love a good trans agenda. I literally have whole text threads that are just titled like, the trans agenda, like this is what we're gonna do. So this is an example. This is Miriam Grossman, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, testifying in the House of Representatives in June, claiming there is no standard. There is a debate, a fierce debate. Veteran clinician, she's speaking of herself here, and others who have wisdom and experience are ignored. They're against medical interventions for the same reason these European countries are. There's no evidence of long-term benefit. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna go ahead and call bullshit on this whole thing. This is from the New York Times, right? Concern trolling, both sidesing. They paused puberty, but is there a cost? Concerns are growing. You can just feel the pearls being clutched. And evidence is being distorted. And then this is a real gem from Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, about radical gender ideology, which is certainly what I subscribe to. I do, right? Don't we all? I mean, come on. One of the things that you will not see in these messages right here is that these laws will cause elevated rates of suicide among trans young people. This is a flag for everybody. It has come up fairly often where we say, and I apologize for the language, I guess sort of there should be a trigger warning for this, but these laws will cause kids to kill themselves. We do say that sometimes. They have noticed that, and they are pushing back. They are pointing out that actually we don't have a lot of good data about death by suicide. What we do have is a lot of good data, unfortunately, about suicidality among trans young people. I am very guilty of this. I use gender affirming care a lot because that is what it is. Also though, messaging research is increasingly showing that this term is unfamiliar to broad audiences, and when they hear it, they think trans kids in the driver's seat. Many of us here, I think we all support trans kids in the driver's seat because it's their bodies, it's their lives. But when you think about folks who don't know trans people, they're very scared by the idea that young people are making irreversible decisions and that no one else has any oversight over those decisions. So gender affirming, when they hear that phrase, they think you go to a doctor and the doctor says, yeah, whatever, I don't even know, I don't even care. And yeah. So focusing on descriptions such as medically necessary care, essential medical care, prescribed medical care. Similarly, the term transition, 100% for folks activates the frame of surgery. So when we talk about things like social transition, what they hear is surgeries on kids. Avoiding details like assigning ages, to when people can get different types of care. And the explanation for that is that this care is individualized and age appropriate.